Morning. We'll go ahead and get started. I hope the cold hasn't deterred too many people. If that didn't, maybe the ice did. Hope you had a good holiday. Hope you had a good day over the last few days. I had a great day yesterday with my favorite team winning. Big game. That's why I have this tie on. So, that was a good day. And Everett had a good day too, because the team that they beat, that means his team's in the championship game now. Yeah. Thank you, Michigan. We're continuing our study through the Gospel of Matthew, and today we're going to begin Matthew chapter 13. Matthew 13, we've talked about it at length already, but Matthew 13 is the third of Matthew's 5 major discourses. These discourses are these big clumps of teaching that you have in Matthew's Gospel account. We've already looked at the first two, the first one being the Sermon on the Mount. That's 3 chapters in length, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And then we've also looked at Matthew chapter 10, which is the second of these big discourses, when Jesus commissions the 12 and sends them out and so on and so forth. And now we come to the third of this, which is the parables of the kingdom. And so it's a pretty well-known chapter in Matthew's Gospel, and in fact, a lot of people regard this chapter as the climax of the teachings of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel account. And I say the climax of the teachings because the climax of the book itself is obviously the death, burial, and resurrection. But this is the climax of the teachings of Jesus in regards to some of the things that he teaches on. And it makes sense that this is the middle discourse out of the 5 big ones. There's discourse and teachings all throughout, but there's the big clumps of it, and this is one of them, and this is kind of the middle part of it. So in this chapter, Jesus, he teaches exclusively with parables. And you may have heard that word used before, thinking about a parable, but what exactly is a parable? Well, the Greek word that is used is parabole, and the word literally means, this is according to BDAG Greek lexicon, it is a narrative or saying of varying length. It could be shorter, it could be longer. We'll have a few shorter ones. We'll also have a few longer ones. It's a narrative or saying of varying length designed to illustrate a truth, especially through comparison or simile. And so simile is when you make a comparison but you use the words like or as. And Jesus does this in this chapter where he'll say the kingdom is like, and then he'll go into it. And so what we see Jesus using here is these parables where he tells this sort of story and it illustrates a bigger point. And you'll see what I mean as we go through this. And so this is the structure of the whole chapter. I hope that's not too small for you to read. We're not going to go through the whole chapter, but we're going to go through the parables, Lord willing, if we get through all of what I've prepared. And that takes us through verse 52, and the chapter actually ends with Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. Lord willing, we'll pick up there next week. But you have the parable of the sower. That gets explained later. Then there's the purpose of the parables, why Jesus uses these parables as a way of teaching. Then you have the parable of the weeds. Some of your versions might say the parable of the tares. Then there's the parables of the mustard seed and of the leaven. There's a little note that Matthew adds in there about how this is the fulfillment of prophecy, Jesus teaching in parables. Then the parable of the weeds is explained. And then there's a few other smaller parables toward the end. And then eventually Jesus will be rejected in his hometown, which we're kind of leading to that point. And eventually through Matthew's Gospel, we're leading to the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. But for now, we're still in the Galilean region. And so what we see before we get into the parables themselves is Matthew, in the first couple of verses of the chapter, he sets the scene for us, where you see the transition from chapter 12 into chapter 13. And so it says, that same day, and this is looking back at chapter 12, that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach. And so we see that Jesus is still in the region of Galilee. He's been in this region since chapter 4. He was in the Judean wilderness. He underwent the temptation there from the devil. And then when John the Baptizer is thrown into prison, Jesus withdraws from there, and he goes from Judea to Galilee. And he's been in Galilee since then. And presumably at this point, he's in or around his hometown of Nazareth. He went to Nazareth in chapter 9 and verse 1. It said he went to his city. And nothing that I can see has indicated that he's ever left at this point. And so we assume that he's still in Nazareth, if not in the general area. And so he went to Nazareth in chapter 9. We assume he's still there. We also saw at the end of chapter 12 that his mother and his brothers came and wanted to speak to him. And so they would have been in Nazareth. That's where they lived at. And so they come to him, and this whole thing sort of culminates at the end of the chapter when Nazareth ultimately rejects Jesus. And Lord willing, we'll look at that in more detail next week. And so he's in Galilee, presumably Nazareth, and while he is sitting beside the sea, and we assume that's the Sea of Galilee, great crowds all of a sudden gather to him. And you got to wonder, well, why would these crowds gather to him? I think a better question is, why wouldn't they gather to him? Given all of the things that he's done. He's been doing these healings. He's taught with authority. And so Jesus, of course, is drawing a pretty big crowd, and these great crowds gather to him. And it's to the point where I don't know if it's maybe this is a tactic that Jesus uses to be able to teach them better, using the waves to amplify perhaps his sound, or maybe he just needed to get away from the big crowd. But the crowd is standing on the beach, and Jesus ends up going out into a boat. And in verse 3, we see that he begins teaching to them. I think this is probably a way of Jesus to amplify his voice a little better. The waves would have carried his voice a little better. So that perhaps is what's going on, but maybe he just needed to get away from the crowd too. I can relate to that a little bit. And so now we begin to see these parables. And so in verse 3, it says, and he told them many things in parables. And then he gets into the first of these parables. And the first parable that he teaches them is what's commonly called the parable of the sower. Some commentators call it the parable of the soil. And that's perhaps a better title for this, because there's a sower, but really it's more about the soil and what kind of soil the seed falls on and so on and so forth. So picking up in verse 3, Jesus says, a sower went out to sow. And that's not sowing like with yarn, but it's sowing seed. You go about and you scatter seed everywhere. That's what he means. A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. And so he gives them this parable. And what we see with this is there's someone who is sowing seed, and the seed that he sows, because the seed is the purpose in that is to try to grow some sort of a plant. And it falls on 4 different places. And what we see happen here is with each place that the seed falls on, there's a different outcome. One location leads to this, another to this, and so on and so forth. And so you have one seed falls along the path. This is sort of I think of it as falling like on concrete, where it doesn't really have a chance to get implanted into the ground. And what happens? Birds come and they devour it. So that's the first location and the first outcome. The seed that falls along the path, it gets devoured. You have another seed that falls on rocky ground. And what happens with that, it says there's not much soil, and they spring up, but because there's no depth of the soil, they eventually get scorched and they wither up. So that's the second location, second outcome. The seed that falls on rocky ground, it gets scorched and it gets withered away. Then you have some that falls among thorns. Thorns tend to restrict good growth. So what happens, it says it grew up and the thorns choked them. So the seed that falls among the thorns gets choked out. Then you have what is the desired outcome of all of this. You have the seed that falls on good soil, and it produces grain, and it's fruitful. It bears fruit, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30, and so on. So you have seed falling on different locations, and each location leads to a different outcome. So that raises the question, okay, what does this have to do with anything? What is the purpose in Jesus saying this? Well, before we get, because he's going to explain what this means, but before he explains it, the disciples ask him, well, why are you doing this? Why are you teaching these people in these parables? So picking up in verse 10, the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? Now remember, Jesus is addressing these parables to this crowd that's gathered along the beach. And the disciples say, why are you doing this? He answered them, to you, he's addressing the disciples, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear. So in short, what we see here is the disciples ask, why are you teaching them in parables? And it's interesting because you would think using these parables, they sort of serve almost like an illustration. When I was in school learning to teach and preach and so on, one of the things that they taught us is when you're teaching and preaching, you should use illustrations because it illustrates what you're talking about. People may not understand it this way, but if you illustrate it a different way, maybe that helps people understand. It gives them a visual of what you're talking about. It gives them something that they can relate to, so on and so forth. So you might assume that this is perhaps to make Jesus' teachings easier to understand. That's sort of how we think of using illustrations to this day, but the illustrations like what preachers use today is different than these parables that Jesus is using. Because actually what he's doing is he's concealing the meaning behind what really is more like a riddle than anything. It's like a riddle that they have to try to understand. And so what we see Jesus saying here is the disciples have been given this understanding. This is a gift from God that they have, but that gift isn't for everybody. And so what we see is instead of Jesus spoon-feeding them like he has been, because they're going to reject him, keep in mind, instead of the spoon-feeding, they're going to have to try to listen for themselves. And so what we see with this is the burden of understanding now falls on those that are hearing. No longer is Jesus simply spoon-feeding them. He's done that, and they are in the process of rejecting him. So now if you want to actually understand what Jesus is saying, you've got to actually try to understand it. And so that's what we see happening here. The burden of understanding is going to fall on those that are hearing. And then he quotes this prophecy. They hear, but they don't understand. They see, but they don't perceive, so on and so forth. And now we get into the explanation behind the parable of the sower. And so in verse 18, he says, hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, In one case, 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So it's interesting, when you come across some of these parables, there's a lot of debate as to what the parables mean and so on and so forth. We don't have to debate that in this case because Jesus actually explains it. And so he tells them this parable's about the kingdom. He says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and doesn't understand it and so on. So this is about the kingdom, and what we see is all of these parables are about the kingdom. And so this parable is about the kingdom, and he mentions that the seed that is being sown, that is the word of the kingdom. That's the gospel, right? He came and said, repent, for the kingdom is at hand. This is what he's talking about. Ultimately, Jesus is going to die, and then you have the gospel and so on and so forth. And so the seed is the word of the kingdom, the repentance because of the coming kingdom. We see next that the seed, where the seed falls, is the state of the one who hears the word. And so you have different people in different states that are all receiving the same seed. And it's interesting because the seed is the same, but the soil is different, and it's the soil that leads to different outcomes. It's not the seed, but it's the soil that matters here. And so what we see with this is it's the outcome of the hearer that determines the outcome of the seed. In other words, you have the same message, you have the same gospel that's being proclaimed, but it's going to fall on different ears, and the different ears will lead to different outcomes. And this is, you could think about this, and this is true today, and this is so relevant because our job is to sow the seed of the kingdom. We have the song that we sing, right? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother? So on and so forth. Our job is to sow that seed. We come to that in Matthew 28, to go into all the world and preach the gospel and so on and so forth. Go on and make disciples is what Jesus says in Matthew 28. And so that's our job, but the message can be the same, but people are going to respond to it differently. And so coming back to this idea, there's sort of an allegorical interpretation that Jesus gives here. Not every parable has this, but this one does, where each part of the parable has a specific meaning behind it. And so we see first that the different locations and lead to different outcomes and so on, that is representative of different people. And so the location determines the outcome. And so you have, on the one hand, that which is sown along the path, and as he says, they hear the word and they don't understand it. It falls on deaf ears. These are the stubborn, stiff-necked kind of people. You tell them, and they don't listen. So these people don't understand it, and the outcome is these people are snatched by the evil one. Before the seed falls on, I think of it as concrete or a sidewalk or something, and then birds come up and they eat it. Well, it's snatched in this case by the evil one. Then you have that which falls on rocky ground, and what happens with this is it's not able to take root. They eagerly accept the message, but they accept it in a shallow kind of a way. And we've probably known people that have fallen into this category. They fall in feet first, but it's shallow, and what ends up happening is they fall away after any sort of tribulation. There's the old expression, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. There's two ways you could interpret that. One is they get going and they go to work. The other way is they get going and they leave. And that's what happens in this case. They fall away after this tribulation that they endure. Then you have what is sown among thorns. And what happens with this, and we obviously know people that fall into this category as well, where the cares of the world overtake them. They get caught up in the temptation of riches and the concerns of the world. They're more planted in the world than they are in the church. And so worldly matters overtake them, and what happens is they are choked out and they prove ultimately to be unfruitful. But then finally you have what's on good soil. This is the one who hears and understands. And by understanding, he means actually doing what it says. That's what he means by understanding it. And what happens with this is it bears fruit and it gives yields. So we want to be good soil, and we want other people to be good soil. Unfortunately, not everyone is good soil. Unfortunately, you're going to have some people that are going to be among thorns, or you're going to have some that are rocky ground. You're going to have some that are along the path. And so what we see with this is you have different locations, different kinds of people, and that leads to different outcomes. Sometimes we undergo this and we sow the seed, and we think, well, maybe I'm sowing it wrong. Sometimes maybe that's true, because I think you can sow seed wrong. But oftentimes, there's nothing wrong with the sower, and there's nothing wrong with the seed. We know there's obviously nothing wrong with the seed, the news of the kingdom. But what happens is it's a matter of the kind of people that we're dealing with. So thinking about this parable, what does this say about the kingdom? Because this is about the kingdom. One thing we see is that there needs to be people that are willing to sow the seed. The whole premise of this falls apart if there's not someone sowing the seed. We need someone sowing seed. The seed falls because someone is sowing it. It doesn't happen to fall. You have to have someone actually sowing it. And so what this tells us is we need people willing to spread the news of Jesus Christ, the gospel. We need not just preachers and teachers and so on and so forth. We need Christians willing to do this. This falls on every one of us, not just people who perhaps are employed by a church or what have you. And so the seed falls because someone is sowing it. And if no one is sowing seed, then there's not going to be any seed that falls. No one's going to hear the word. And so this kind of goes back to what Jesus said once before when he sees the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. It's a similar sort of thing. We need people willing to go out and actually sow that seed. So that's one thing. That's kind of an obvious thing. You need people sowing the seed, otherwise nothing gets done. The whole example falls apart. But another thing we see, and this is the big takeaway, the outcome of the seed is based on the recipients and not based on the sower, and especially not based on the seed. We know that the seed is good. It comes from God. It's God's good news, right? The good news of Jesus Christ. And so the outcome is based on the recipient. It's based on the soil that the seed falls on. What we see with this is that the sower indiscriminately sows seed. You may know that you're sowing seed on rocky ground or along the path. You may know that. But it's not our job to determine where the seed goes. Our job is to sow the seed indiscriminately. It may fall wherever it falls, but our job is simply to sow the seed. Some may see that as a waste. When it comes to something of this much importance, there is no waste. Everyone needs to hear it. And we see that the results are based on what kind of ground the seed falls on. Did you have something to say, Garfield?
That's really good what you're saying. It's in the 3rd chapter of 1 Corinthians in verse 5. It talks about, Paul says, I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. He talked about that conversion during that period of time.
Right. Garfield mentioned in 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul says that he planted the seed and Apollos watered the seed. That says another thing that kind of adds to the imagery here, where you have someone who plants, and then you may have someone else who waters. And we see ultimately it's God who's going to give the yield or give the increase. And so with this parable, we see the second thing here is the outcome is based on the recipients, not based on the sower. One can't help but wonder why Jesus so frequently says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. That draws the burden now on those that are hearing it, right? And so this is what we see happening here. The results are based on those that are hearing it. It's not indicative of the seed. It's not necessarily indicative of the sower. It's indicative on the soil that it falls on. And we also see with this the idea of free will. We see in this the fact that the word is not forced on anyone. People aren't forced to obey it. People might say, well, if the gospel is so good, if it's so compelling, if Jesus is so powerful and mighty, then why aren't people necessarily always compelled to follow him? And the reason is because God gives us the choice as to whether we do or not. Each of you are here because you chose to be here. It's not like you were coerced to be here. You chose to be here. And then the same thing is true in terms of if you're in the kingdom or if you're not in the kingdom. You choose to be that good soil. You choose to receive the word with eagerness and to bear fruit and so on and so forth. there's the expression that I like to use. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Some of you have dealt with some stubborn horses in your time, I'm sure. You lead it to water and it won't drink it. That's how it is with some people. You can lead them along the way. You can tell them all the right things. You could be as compassionate and as loving as you can be. But ultimately, some people are still going to reject it because they have the choice to do that. And when you give people the choice, that's inevitable that some people will reject it. That's just inevitable about what's going to happen. Another thing we see with this parable is that there's outside influence. There's the one sowing the seed, but there's other powers at be with this as well. With some of these examples, we see the evil one is at work. He comes and he snatches and devours that seed when it falls along the path. You have also the cares of the world. That's a big influence on a lot of people that we know. You have persecution. That's maybe not necessarily the biggest influence in America. It is an influence, but maybe not the biggest one. But in other parts of the world, it certainly is. We have a lot of brothers and sisters that are severely persecuted. All of these things can influence the outcome. Because you think about it, if the seed falls along rocky ground and it's not scorched, then maybe that yields good fruit. We don't know. But because of these different influences, it takes it away. And so we see that there's a lot of influence with this as well. So that is the parable of the sower, or the parable of the soil, you could say. Let me get to you at the end, CJ. I got a lot of material. I don't have time for you, CJ. I like giving him a hard time if you haven't noticed that. So now we come to the next parable, and this is the parable of the weeds or the parable of the tares, depending on how your version reads. The ESV calls it the parable of the weeds, so that's what I'm going to call it. So starting in verse 24, he put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat among with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" So with this example, you have wheat that is sown, you have good seed, and then you have weeds that are planted, or tares that are planted. And so you have weeds that are sown among good seeds. And what happens is when that plant comes up, the good seed sprouts and it leads to a good crop, but you also have the weeds that sprout up with it. And so you've got, if you're looking visually at the garden, you've got kind of a messy garden where you got a plant over here and you got a weed over here and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of messy. And we have the tendency to try to pull up the weeds, one, because it might constrict what we've planted, and two, it just doesn't look good, at least not to our eye. And we see that these weeds, they're sown by an enemy. So there's deception that comes here, where an enemy comes and sows these weeds among with the good seed. And so what we see happen here is they ask, should we go and should we gather these weeds? And what the sower says is, don't gather them until the time of the harvest. And the reason for that is you don't want to prematurely accidentally pull up the good plant along with the bad. If you've ever pulled weeds before, you know inevitably you're going to pull a weed up and you're going to pull something else along with it. Because it's just really difficult unless you've got surgical hands to be able to only pull up the bad and leave the good that's in there. And so this is so as to not prematurely pull up the good grain along with the weeds. And we see ultimately when they do come and they harvest this, the weeds are going to be burned, the good grain, the wheat, is going to be put into the barn. In a moment, Jesus is going to explain this again, but just chronologically, we're going to keep going through here. We come to verse 31, and he gives two other shorter parables. And these two are kind of related to each other, and you'll see what I mean. This is the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. So starting in verse 31, it says, He put another parable before them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. A lot of seeds that Jesus uses here. These are images that his hearers would have at least been somewhat aware of. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So you have these two examples here. You have the mustard seed and you have the leaven. And what we see happen here is, in both of these examples, you have small things. You have a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all the seeds. And then you have leaven, which leaven is really small. But it eventually has large impacts. I think, for example, of in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6, where Paul says, don't you know that even just a little leaven will leaven the whole lump? Well, that's what we see happen here. A little bit of leaven has a big impact. It leavens everything with it. And with the mustard seed, it starts small, but it sprouts into this big tree, and you have birds coming and making nests in it. It's that kind of a tree. And so you have two little things that lead to these large impacts. That raises the question, what in the world does this have to do with the kingdom? Because in both of these cases, he says the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he gives these parables. So what do these have to do with the kingdom? Well, there's a lot of, this is one where Jesus doesn't give the exact interpretation like he does with the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds. But I think we can come across a pretty simple understanding of this, where you have a small and a humble beginning, small referring to the seed, humble referring to something like leaven, and then you could use those interchangeably as well. Something small and something humble can have a pretty big impact. And you can think about this in terms of Jesus and what eventually happens with the kingdom. You have one Lord, right? You have Jesus. He's one person. And then he brings in his inner circle of people. You have the 12 apostles. So you have one Lord, 12 apostles or disciples. You have a small beginning. You have a humble beginning. You think about Jesus and his beginning, born of woman, born in the manger, so on and so forth. Jesus simply being human is humble enough, but then you look at how he was actually born, and that's humble as well. So you look at how small that is and how humble that is, and look at the outcome. You have, of course, Jesus going to the cross. He is the atoning sacrifice for all of our sins, not just the people present, but all people across all time from then on. Jesus is that sacrifice. He is the atonement for all people, people who willingly accept that. And you have an eternal kingdom that is the result of that. And so what I perceive with this is you have a small beginning, but you have a pretty big impact that is still being felt today. That's why we're all here, all these years later. Then we have what is sort of an intercession in the midst of this teachings from Jesus, where Matthew sort of interjects here, and he talks about how these things are the fulfillment of prophecy. And you may remember, this is a pretty common theme in Matthew's gospel, is Jesus doing these things that fulfill prophecy from the Old Testament. There's a lot of it that Matthew alludes to. And this is an example of one that is sort of like a double fulfillment, where you read what happens, and he's actually quoting from Psalm 78 and verse 2. And in the context of Psalm 78, it has its own immediate context. But then Matthew takes it and he makes it apply here to Jesus. And this is another example of double fulfillment, which is very common in Matthew's gospel. You can think about the fulfillment of the virgin birth. That is something that had an immediate context in Isaiah, but then Jesus also fulfills that. And that happens over and over again. Out of Egypt I've called my son. That initially applied to the people of Israel. That applied to the Exodus. But then Matthew attributes it to Jesus when he's moving around after he's been born, and he eventually leaves Egypt and goes to Judea and so on and so forth. And so this is another example. I'll read what Matthew writes here. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This is to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. And then he quotes Psalm 78 in verse 2, which says, I'll open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. So that's just a little interjection that Matthew gives. And now we come back to the teachings. And now Jesus explains the parable of the weeds. He's already given the parable, and now he gives an explanation to it. So starting in verse 36, then he left the crowds and went into the house. So now, this is private now. He's in a house. He's no longer in a boat speaking to the crowd. But now this is private. And so from here on, the audience is not a crowd, but the audience is Jesus' disciples. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. So the disciples specifically ask about this one. They don't get it. He answered, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. You notice that little refrain again at the end. So he explains the parable. And this is similar to the parable of the sower, where each aspect of it has its own sort of interpretation. So in the story, you have the one who sows seed. That is the Son of Man. You have the field. That is the world. The Son of Man is sowing this seed into the world. The good seed, the seed that sprouts up, those are the sons of the kingdom. Then you have the weeds that also sprout up, and these are the sons of the evil one. The enemy who sowed these weeds is the devil. The harvest, they're waiting, of course, until the harvest to gather all of these up. The harvest is the end of the age. Those that are reaping it are angels. The weeds are going to be burned. That refers to, in Matthew's words, in Jesus' words, it's a fiery furnace. We could think of it as hell. And then the wheat go into the barn. In Jesus' words, they're going to be shining in the kingdom. We could think of that as heaven. And so Jesus gives this explanation of this parable, the parable of the weeds. And so what we see happen here is the enemy has sown weeds among the good seed. So the devil comes, and you have what is ultimately either the sons of the kingdom or sons of the evil one. You could divide the world into these two groups of people, and that's ultimately how the world will be divided at the end of the age. They'll be separated at the harvest, at the end of the age, by these angels. And what we see is you have two groups of people, and you have two outcomes. And this is something that we see in Matthew over and over and over again. We're going to see it again when you get later on, say chapter 25, for example, the sheep and the goats. That's another example of this. Here's a pretty prominent example of that. The weeds are going to be gathered and they're going to be burned. But then the wheat is going to be gathered, it's going to be put in the barn, and those sons of the kingdom will shine in the kingdom. So this is a pretty simple parable once Jesus explains it. Jesus gives us the correct interpretation of it. There's going to be a separation, there's going to be a gathering, and there's going to be different outcomes. And what we see happen with this is the outcome is determined on whether you accept Jesus or if you reject Jesus. And we see this especially when you get to the end of this chapter when Jesus is rejected at Nazareth. That's something that's going on here with Matthew as well. So we come now toward the end of this chapter, and we get to the point where Jesus is going to start telling a few smaller parables, but they're rich in meaning. So he tells a pair of related parables starting in verse 44, where he says, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. So he likens the kingdom to a treasure hidden in a field and then a pearl of fine value. What this tells us is that the kingdom is very valuable, right? It's just like treasure in a field or a pearl. We see also that this is something that people need to find. Perhaps people need to be led to it. And in both of these parables, what we see, they're very related. They're almost kind of a couplet of telling the same thing. The one who found them, the one who found the treasure, the one who finds the pearl, they sell all that they have, and they make sure that they receive what they have found, either the treasure or the pearl. This tells us then what we do with the kingdom. When we find the kingdom, what we do is we give up everything we have, and we make sure that we have that kingdom. And there's a lot of ways you could interpret that. You could interpret that in terms of riches. You can interpret that in terms of things that might be hindering us, so on and so forth. Next we have the parable of the net. This is starting in verse 47, where he says, Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We see again, there's a separation. You have two groups, the good and the bad. In this case, it's referring to fish. The good will be stored away, the bad will be thrown away. We see that every kind of fish are gathered, but eventually they'll be sorted. And again, the good will be kept, but the bad will be thrown away. And he says, so will it be at the end of the age. He gives an explanation for this. This is exactly how it's going to be. At the end of the age, there's going to be that separation. The good will be sorted from the bad, and there's going to be two different outcomes. And what we see with this, and what I think Matthew was trying to drill into his readers, is you got to ask the question, which outcome would you rather be part of? Would you rather be that group that is in the fiery furnace, or would you rather be the group that is kept? The group that's going to, going back to the previous example, that's going to shine in the kingdom. So finally we come to what is the last parable that Jesus gives, and it's the parable of the new and old treasures. But first notice, before he gets into the parable, Jesus asks his disciples a question. Because remember, the audience is now the disciples. They're in a private place. And Jesus asks them in verse 51, Have you understood all these things? And they said to him, Yes. Simple answer. Yeah, we get it. And remember, in verse 11, they were given this understanding. Sometimes Jesus has to explain things to them, but more or less they understand what he's saying. He's revealing these things about the kingdom to them. And then he gives them this parable found in verse 52. And he said to them, Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. This is a really interesting one. A lot of scholars are kind of divided about this. You have the mention of a scribe. A scribe is a teacher. That's sort of how you think of it. And to a degree, we're all supposed to be teachers. We're all supposed to be scribes. And what he says is, if you're trained for the kingdom, which he has just trained them for, and perhaps is still in the process of training them for, they are like a master of a house. You're the king of the castle. This is your house. You rule the roost, right? And what happens? You're bringing out your treasure, but you don't just bring out the new stuff. You bring the old stuff out as well. You're showing them all of it. So what in the world does this mean? What is this new and old treasure? This is what scholars are divided about. There's a lot of different interpretations about this. The simplest one that I see is what most people assume, where you could either think of it as the Old Testament and New Testament, or simply put the old teachings in the new teachings. Because They don't have the New Testament yet, but it's still coming, right? And so you have old teachings and new teachings that are coming in. One commentator that Bert Kaufman quotes puts it this way: the old truths which God had long made known to the Jews, as well as the new truth declared by Christ. So you have that which is old and that which is new. The master of the house comes and he brings out both. Think of this like what Paul talks about to the Ephesian elders about the whole counsel of God, right? So on and so forth. The new treasure, shiny, it's nice. The old treasure also has value. So what we see with this is the disciples are now well equipped. They have been trained for the kingdom, and they're equipped with not just that which is old, but now they're equipped with that which is new. They have not just the teaching of the law and the prophets, but they have the teachings of Christ as well. And what we see is these complement each other. It's not like one contradicts the other one. It's not like that at all. It's like what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, I haven't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Jesus fulfills them, and thus they complement each other. So in summary, you look at all these parables, and Jesus gives us a great number of them. What have these parables taught us about the kingdom? I tried to boil it down to one main idea, but really there's a few main ideas that come about from this, so I'll quickly go over some of them. We see that there's a need for people to be sowing the seed. We need people sharing the gospel. That's true not just of preachers. There is, of course, if you keep up with resources like the Christian Chronicle and so on, they talk a lot about how there's a shortage of preachers out there. I hear about it a lot. I hear a lot about this congregation's looking, this congregation's looking. People are always in my ear. Do you know a person who could fill this? Would you be interested in filling this? I'm not, but so on and so forth. There's a shortage of preachers, but there's also a shortage of Christians willing to share the gospel with other people. So that's one thing. We see also with this seed that some of it's going to fall on good soil and some of it's not. That's just how it is. And what we see is where the seed lands, it's not the fault of the one sowing the seed, it's the fault of the soil that it falls on. We see that among wheat that is planted by the Son of Man, among the sons of the kingdom, there's also weeds that are planted by the devil, the sons of the devil, the sons of the evil one. And what we see in this is we don't pluck them out. We let the reapers do it at the end of the age. And it's going to be done at the harvest. Because we don't want to pull up any wheat prematurely. That's why you may hear me sometimes say, well, I'm not the judge. God is the judge. I don't condemn people. I simply say, hey, you're on the wrong path, so on and so forth. You're in danger of this, so on and so forth. We're not the ones who are making the harvest. That's going to happen at the end of the age. The angels will take care of that. We also see that something small, like a mustard seed or like leaven, can have a big impact. And that really is the story of the kingdom. Humble beginnings leads, of course, to this eternal kingdom that we're all part of. You have one Lord, you have 12 apostles, that eventually grows into a kingdom that spans the globe. We also see that the kingdom has significant value. I'd go as far as saying there's nothing more valuable than the kingdom, than being part of the kingdom. And so like the person who finds the treasure hidden in the field, we need to surrender all in order to receive it. And then finally, there's going to be a time and a place when the people of the earth will be sorted. We saw this repeatedly. The good will be kept, and the bad will be thrown away. So where do we want to be? That's all. Thanks for your attention.